All right, so we are moving on to our final unit, which is poetry. Again, this is going to look much different than it typically would had we all been in class together. So I just wanted to let you know that some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this presentation is still relative and you do need to know it. However, I'm not going to have you include it into the poems. Your next presentation is going to be over different types of poems. I narrowed it down to 3, and you will be writing 3 poems. But again, some of the stuff we're going to talk about in this particular presentation, I want you to be able to know and to define, but I'm not actually going to have you implement them in your poems unless you really want to. It's not going to be a requirement. Because I simply can't be there with you to show it to you. And poetry is much more than just reading it silently to yourself. With poetry, it's meant to be read out loud. There's a rhythm, there's thoughts that are evoked from it. And in order for us to really, really have that understanding of it, it would be better if we were together. Unfortunately, we're not. So we're going to do what we can. So I wanted to start off with just a basic definition of poetry. Poetry, literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. So there's a lot going on there. With poetry, typically because they are a little bit shorter, we do have to use stronger word choice that helps us to express a specific emotion. And the other words that we use, that diction piece that we talked about when we did our descriptive essays, are arranged in a way that really evoke the meaning of what the poet wants the readers to understand after reading the poem, and how it sounds. We are going to cover some different ways that we can include different types of sounds in our poems, but that's going to be one of the things that you guys will not be required to include in your poems unless you actually want to, okay? So first of all, we're going to talk about some common literary devices and figurative language found in poetry. A lot of this stuff is going to be a review for you, but I still like to cover it. So imagery with poems, because they're typically shorter, we do need to use all of the 5 senses. You guys had a lot of practice with this when you wrote your descriptive essay. So that's using that sense of taste, that sense of smell, that sense of sight, that sense of hearing, and that sense of touch, okay? Along with that, diction. Again, we've already done this. So this is our word choice. So instead of saying cold, we might say frigid. So when we choose our words carefully, that helps us to create better images and flow for the reader. Okay. Again, I will still encourage you guys when you are writing your own poems, within the next few days, that you do use a thesaurus or a synonym, or use synonyms. You can look them up on your device to make your word choice just sound so much better, right? And we know, we've had practice with it. It's a simple thing that really does help to make our writing sound that much more educated, okay? Again, using those adverbs and adjectives as well. Onomatopoeia, we've covered this before. I'm sure you guys have heard this. These are words used to refer to the sounds that an object can make. And I gave some examples on there. So this onomatopoeia really does help with that sense of hearing when it comes to imagery, okay? We have similes. We've already talked about similes before. This is when we compare 2 unlike objects by using words like or as. So he is as tall as a giraffe. She is as slow as a sloth. Okay. So we compare 2 things by using the words like or as for the sake of emphasis. Okay. Then we have a metaphor, which does the same thing, but it's in a different way. Metaphors compare 2 objects by saying that one thing is another. So for example, if I said this slice of pizza is a piece of heaven from above, I'm comparing pizza to heaven. Okay, so when we think of heaven, we think of something, miraculous or something that's really special or something good. It has a positive connotation. So if I'm comparing my pizza to heaven, we're going to assume that, the pizza is actually really, really good. Okay. Personification. Okay. If you look right in that word, we have that word person. That's always how I tell students to remember this. So when we give human-like or person-like qualities are given to animals or inanimate objects. So you can think of any Disney movie, right? We have in Beauty and the Beast, for example, we have Mrs. Potts, who's a teapot, and she talks. Okay. If you think of Toy Story, all of those toys actually come to life and they start talking. Okay. So we use that in poetry sometimes to really evoke the topic. So for example, if there was a poem about nature and I said that the trees were dancing in the wind, We know that trees don't really dance, but what that does is it helps us to create a more of a visual of the way that the trees are moving or swaying. Okay. Symbolism. This one is a little bit more difficult to develop in your own writing, but it's a lot easier when you see a piece of writing and to be able to pull it out. But I still wanted to cover it with you guys because I would encourage you to try to use these things in your poetry if you can. Okay. So symbolism is the use of an object to express or represent ideas or qualities in literature, art, movies, or etc. So in a way, similar to similes and metaphors, we have a symbol that represents something else. Okay. We're not comparing it, but it's that idea that we're using something to compare it to, or to say that it is something else. So for example, those of you that have seen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, we have that poison apple. And that poison apple represents temptation or desire. Snow White knows that she's not supposed to have it, but she's tempted by it. Okay. So because she's tempted by it, that apple is a symbol for temptation. Or Peter Pan, if you've ever seen that movie, the shadow at the beginning. He's chasing it around the Darling household. And what that shadow is representing is one's dark side, or saying that, everybody has this mischievous part to them. Okay. So again, symbolism, whether you use it in your poems or not, the ones that I'm going to require you to use, I wanted you to know this definition along with all of the others for the sake of poetry in itself when you read it in the future for maybe another class. All right, so now we're going to be talking about some different sounds that are used, some devices that poets can use. I think most of you know this, or maybe you don't. I am a huge Eminem fan, the rapper, especially because, where I grew up, he was not too far from where my parents' house is. And I grew up listening to his music. Not necessarily the most appropriate, but nonetheless, he is a true poet in his music. Okay, most music, you could think of it as poetry. Normally, I would have you guys do an assignment called Music is Poetry, where I have you create a Google slide presentation of a song that you choose, and I have you pull out these different literary devices. So if you have, some free time, which I think that most of you do, you guys could really do that. Think about a song that you really love and pull out these poetic devices, okay? So back to alliteration, though. Eminem and most other musicians are huge on alliteration, consonants, and assonance, which are going to be the next two slides. So alliteration is a literary device in which a number of words having the same first consonant sound occur close together in a series. Okay, so if you'll look at my examples, the things that I have underlined, they're all the same. But a better butter makes a batter better. We have that B sound at the beginning of all of these words in this line. Okay, so this is a line filled with words, but that B sound is repeated. So when we have that repetitive sound towards the beginning, it really does help to create the rhythm of a poem. Again, poetry is meant to be read out loud. So when you hear certain things in poetry, it is intentional. Okay. A big bully beats a bashful boy. So again, we have that B sound. Shelley sells shells by the seashore. Okay, so we have that S sound repeated. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is consonants. And I know automatically you guys might be looking at those next two, the second and third examples, and you're like, well, we already talked about that. There's alliteration there. I'm going to explain consonants and show you how this is an example of consonants. So consonants is when we have repetitive sounds that are produced by consonants within a sentence or a phrase. Okay, so we do need to, I should have talked about this the last slide, I apologize, but we need to make sure that we know the difference between vowels and consonants. So vowels, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y. Okay, all of the other words in the alphabet are consonants. So when we have alliteration, it has to be a consonant sound. Same with consonants. Okay, so this is when we have those sounds within a sentence or phrase. This repetition often takes place in quick succession, such as in pitter-patter. So pitter-patter, we have that TT sound repeated in both of those words. She ate 7 sandwiches on a sunny Sunday last year. So that N sound, even in that word 7, even though it's near the end, we're still going to count it because 7 sandwiches sunny Sunday. Okay, you can hear that repetitive sound of that N. Okay, Shelley sells shells by the seashore. So sure, we have alliteration, we have that S sound that's repeated, but we also have that L. Shelley sells shells. Okay, so we have that sound that's repeated. But a better butter makes a batter better. Again, we have that alliteration at the beginning, but we also have that T sound that is repeated. Better, butter, batter, better. Okay, so again, consonants. Try to use it in the poems that I assign. I'm not going to make it a requirement because, again, this is something that if we were in class, it would be required, but I would have more time with you to be able to give you some more examples, okay? Finally, we have assonance. So this is the third way that we can produce different sounds throughout our poetry. It's when we have two or more words close to one another, repeat the same vowel sound. So this one is different vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y. But start with different consonant sounds. So go slow over the road. So go slow road. We have that O sound that is drawn out in all of those words. I feel depressed and restless. Okay, so even that E in feel, depressed, restless. Okay, so depending on if it's a, if the vowel sound is drawn out or not, if it's still there, we can still count it. Okay, go and mow the lawn. So go mow. Okay, so we have that O sound that is repeated. Okay, so again, with alliteration, consonants, and assonants, I wanted you to know the definitions. I wanted you to hear what it sounds like. Try to include it in the poems that I'm going to have you write. If you don't, it's okay. It's okay. I understand. Couple more we're going to talk about. Hyperboles, we've talked about these before. It's a figure of speech which involves an exaggeration of ideas for the sake of emphasis. Again, with poetry not being super long and drawn out, a poet sometimes might use hyperboles to really get their point across, to really emphasize the topic. For example, your suitcase weighs a ton. This is not typically a line you'd find in poetry, but for the sake of definition, I wanted to give you guys some examples. We know that a suitcase can't literally weigh a ton. Nobody can lift a ton, okay? What that's saying is that your suitcase is actually really heavy. I'm trying to solve a million issues today. All right, so again, over-exaggeration. You probably don't have a million issues. You might have 5 to 10, but to have a million, you're not going to solve all those, right? If you guys think about it, we use hyperboles in our daily speech. I know I do. I over-exaggerate everything, but that's because I'm either trying to emphasize something, or a lot of times it can be used in humor. I am so tired that I could fall asleep walking. All right, most people are not going to do that unless they have a medical condition. Okay, so we're over-exaggerating how tired we actually are. Then we're going to switch to tone. So tone, attitude of writer towards the subject or an audience. Tone is conveyed through word choice of the author or the viewpoint of a writer on a particular subject. When I was a kid, if my sister and I were arguing, or if I did something I wasn't supposed to be doing and I got into an argument with my parents, one of them would always say, "I don't like your tone of voice." And when they'd say that, it kind of made me realize, okay, well, what I said didn't sound how I wanted it to sound, right? And that's probably because of my word choice, or maybe my inflection, right? The volume. For example, if you've ever seen the movie Ace Ventura, and you must be the Monopoly guy. So this is when Ace Ventura is kind of picking on, one of the people at the fancy dinner. And his tone of voice in that is that he's kind of mocking him, right? I got the highest grade in the class. So hearing that tone of voice is showing that they're excited about something. Are you being serious right now? Grow up, right? Or when I say child, please, okay? All depends on the context and the tone of it, right? So in poetry, depending on what the topic of your poem is, you might choose to have certain phrases or put words together in a certain order that really help to convey your meaning, okay? Then your theme, we've talked about this before too, whether it was in creative writing or if you had me for 6th grade ELA. It's the main idea or underlining meaning of a literary work. This can be stated directly or indirectly. And sometimes this can be kind of tricky with poetry, but I want you guys to do your best with this, but I do want you to realize too, that when you do read poems, there's always a theme. There's always something that the poet wants you to take away or to understand. All right, so now we need to talk a little bit about the structure of poems. So a line, a single grouping of words in a row or same line in a poem. So I have an example down at the bottom. We're going to go through these again so that way you guys know. But lines consist of words. It's just a single line of poetry. Then we have stanza. Stanza is one of the divisions of a poem composed of two or more lines, usually characterized by rhyme scheme and or number of lines. So you can think of stanzas as sections of poems. A lot of times they are divided by a huge break. There might be a couple of spaces in between the stanzas, okay? So stanzas consist of lines. Then we have rhyme scheme, a way of describing the pattern of end rhymes in a poem. Now, I always make the assumption that most of you know how to rhyme words, but sometimes I shouldn't assume that. But when we have words that rhyme, it's when we have words that sound the same. So for example, cat, hat, fat, mat, rat. Okay, we have that sound that's repeated. Bus, Gus, fuss. Okay. In poetry, poems don't always have to rhyme, but a lot of times poets will make them rhyme with a certain set of rhyme scheme, which I'll show you in just a second, for the sake of the way that it sounds. Remember, I'll tell you over and over, poetry is meant to be read out loud. So when you hear these things out loud, it starts to make more sense. We use letters to describe or to label the rhyme scheme, starting with A and then B and then so on. If an end sound repeats the end sound of an earlier line, it gets the same letter. Okay, so I'm going to show you this. I have a really short, lame poem, okay? Roses are red, violets are blue, Miss Bailey is awesome, and so are you. So automatically, let's go back and look at lines. We have 4 lines to this poem. Hopefully you guys are able to see that with the little dots on the side, okay? This poem consists of one stanza. There's only one section. If I skipped a couple of lines where it says, and so are you, skipped a couple of lines below that and started writing more, that would be another stanza. So with rhyme scheme, we always start with line 1. We have that word red. Automatically, that's going to get an A. We look at the second line. That last word is blue. You have to ask yourself, does blue rhyme with red? If it did, we'd give it an A, but it doesn't, so we're going to give it a B. Then we go to awesome. Awesome. Does awesome rhyme with blue or red? No, so we're going to give it a C. And then we're going to go to you, and then we have to backtrack. Does you rhyme with awesome? Nope, so it can't be a C. You does rhyme with blue, though. That's why we had to give it a B. Okay, so rhyme scheme is not necessary to have in poems. A lot of poets do include rhyme scheme in order to make it sound different, but there are poems that do not rhyme, okay? And we are going to talk about that in the next presentation where I talk with you guys about 3 different types of poems. So that is all I have for you on our poetry presentation. Again, this is shortened. I usually talk about a lot more things and we usually go through a lot more examples. But again, with this being an elective class, I don't want to overpower what you're doing in your other classes. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions regarding any of the information we've talked about with the stuff in poetry today. And stay tuned for tomorrow. We're going to have a presentation on 3 different types of poems.